So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce Barb Denson as our program chair. And thank you very much, Barb.
Hi, everyone. Mick Chantler has been a student and instructor of early American studies for over 40 years. He has an MA in history, and he currently teaches at several Bay Area lifelong learning programs, including Dominican College, UC Berkeley, University of Santa Clara, and Sonoma State, as well as Rhodes Scholar programs. And he belongs to the Society of American Baseball Research. Cool. And Mick is talking about cool today, but not in that vein. Okay, Mick, come on up. So glad to have you.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to start just by saying how wonderful it is to be back in person with you all again. This is so fun. I enjoy coming here every year to meet with you all and share your food in this lovely building. It's really one of the high points of my lecture year. So thank you so much for having me back to join you again. And I know we all feel good about returning to normal. So as Barb said, actually all of my talks in the past with you have dealt with historical personages of great, usually political significance. And today we're going to try something different. I'm going to be talking with you for the next 45 minutes or so about a concept, a cultural norm, rather than an individual. And so it's a little bit more slippery of a topic to try to embrace and to clarify than it is talking about Abraham Lincoln. But I think you'll find it to be interesting. I found this to be fascinating as a subject. I was introduced to it just kind of by accident last fall when I was on a trip up in Montana. I wanted to have some reading material, and I saw this book in the airport called The Concept of Cool in Postwar America, written by a man named Joel Dinerstein. And much of what I'm going to be sharing with you today comes from that book. And he makes the assertion that cool as a concept in American popular culture had a very significant impact for about 25 years. It starts around the 1940s. You could stretch it back a little bit earlier, maybe into the 1930s. And then it persists up until about the late 1960s, or maybe as late as the early 1970s, but no more than 20 or 30 years. And what happens to it? Because we still hear the word cool all the time. It's one of the few words from the slang dictionary of the beatnik era that has survived. I mean, think back when we were kids, and we would listen to people talk on the radio or on TV, and words like square would be used, or chick, or hip cat, or scratch for money, or bread for money, or come over to my pad. All those words have disappeared, haven't they? I mean, nobody really says anything like that anymore. But the word cool is still around. Unfortunately, Dinerstein argues the word has lost all of its meaning. It actually had a very specific historical meaning that we'll be digging into today. But around 1970, it just became another term, a synonym really for the word like. You've got a cool dog. Well, really, you can't have a cool dog. I mean, not in Dinerstein's definition of the term. Or you've got a cool pair of sunglasses or something like that. It just doesn't work. The word has been debased, as so many words tend to be, and when it's overused over a long period of time. And as a consequence, it's been leached of its meaning. It really just says it's nice. That's kind of what cool means today, is nice. Well, believe me, these people weren't nice. They didn't want to be nice. That was not what they were trying to achieve by their persona, by their posture, by their language, by the way they presented themselves to the world. So what we'll try to do today is disentangle the original meaning of the word and see where it came from and why it's so important, I think. We should be crystal clear at the outset that the word cool today means it has a positive connotation to it in a real sort of milquetoasty kind of way. But back in those days, people that were consciously adopting the cool posture, the cool pose, you might say, for the world, were actually rebels. They were defiant of authority. Marlon Brando, in his famous line in The Wild One, you might remember, 1954 movie, in which I think it's the policeman in the little town that his motorcycle gang is terrorizing. The policeman says to Marlon Brando, "What exactly is it that you're rebelling against?" And Brando's response, anybody remember? He said, "I don't know, what do you got?" That's a very cool response when you think about it. So we'll be taking a look today at some of the iconic figures of cool. And I think by showing you some of these slides, and I'll try to explain a little bit about how I chose these subjects for the slides. And I think by looking at the people that personified cool over this 25-year period of time, you'll get the idea as to what it really meant back in those days. And sadly, how it's become just another term now without really much meaning to it. Cool, in Dinnerstein's way of thinking, represents a radically different way of making our values internalized. How do we relate to the world? How are we supposed to know how we're going to act in company? How do we know how to dress? All of these things changed remarkably in the 20th century with media developments like movies and television and so forth. The traditional way that we derived our social norms back in earlier times was to look to authority figures and have these authorities tell us what was the right way to behave, how you should eat, how you should dress, how you should act to your superiors, to your, quote, inferiors. Because people certainly in earlier times held a very hierarchical view of society, and you were expected to act in different ways to someone who is higher up on the food chain than you would behave with the scullery maid in the hotel you were staying at. So I've come up with 3 traditional concepts or methods, really, of how we learned how to take, how we absorbed our social cues, you might say, and how to behave. The first one, for centuries, for millennia, really, was for people to go to their priest or their minister and have a chat with him and see what is the right way I'm supposed to behave. I mean, that's been around for ages and ages. In the 18th century, as religion started to lose its grip on the minds of people, at least in Europe and in America, people looked to secular sources for their social cues and their education, so to speak, in how to behave in polite society. George Washington, for example, as a 14-year-old boy, wanted to enter into the Virginia aristocracy. And he really didn't know how to do it. He wasn't raised in an aristocratic household. He was certainly from a well-to-do Virginia family, but there was hardly aristocrats. And he did not go to college, so he couldn't absorb the values from his classmates or from his teachers. So what does he do? He gets a hold of a book a handbook on how to behave yourself properly. And he read this book over and over again, The Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior. It was a manual written by a Spanish aristocrat about 100 years before Washington. And it told Washington exactly what to do in just about every situation. Some of the rules, there's 116 of them, and Washington memorized all 116 rules because he wanted to be the perfect gentleman, and he succeeded in that. But some of them are just comical for us today, like at the dinner table, do not use your knife to pick your teeth after the meal is over. Or if you are standing in front of the fire and warming yourself and you discover that you have vermin on you, be sure not to pick it and squish it inside of any lady. So I think you'd probably all agree that that's good advice. When you're talking with someone, don't get too close to them because otherwise your spittle will fly into their face. I mean, these are pretty basic suggestions that you would have thought Washington might have known without a manual, but it wasn't obvious to Washington. He, like all of us, had to learn how to behave properly. If you were of a philosophical orientation, you might have looked to the ethics manuals of the ancient Greek philosophers in Washington's day. That was a very common way to kind of hammer out your own code of behavior in public. Well, most of us don't do this kind of thing anymore. Most of us absorb our values from popular culture models like movies, music, and books. That's a pretty significant cultural shift when you think about it. Dinerstein makes the idea, or proposes for us, that there were three streams of thought, that you might say, that led to the concept of cool in the 1930s and 1940s. First of all, it was Black music, jazz musicians like Miles Davis depicted here. It's not an accident that Miles Davis always wore sunglasses when he performed. That was part of his persona of cool. It was a mask, you might say, of sort of a protective covering, protective coloration, the biologists might call it, because it enabled him to perform before white audiences without really being seen by the audience. He could kind of keep his cool underneath those glasses and not betray his anger and his sense of frustration at not being accepted as a human being. I mean, Miles Davis was tremendously popular. Mostly white audiences would pay a lot of money to come and see him, but they wouldn't have dared having him over to their house for dinner, would they have? Not in the 1940s. That just wasn't acceptable in polite society at that time. Dinerstein makes the argument that the second source of cool was the French philosophy known as existentialism. And here you see Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. We'll talk a little bit more about how existentialist thought crossed the Atlantic and started to influence significant prominent intellectuals in America and became a source of our own new values in the 1950s when people like Norman Mailer and Gore Vidal started picking up on these French writers' ideas. And then the third source of cool was a particular branch of the movies back in the 1940s and 50s called film noir, dark film. It was a different kind of movie making. I mean, when the movies first became part and parcel of the American entertainment industry in the 1920s, the movies were pretty corny. They were pretty hokey. I mean, everybody had their assigned role. Women were supposed to be demure and nice, and the cowboys were always on the side of virtue and so forth. Well, in film noir, that all changes, and the lines begin to blur between good and evil and the authorities versus the outlaw. All that starts to get pretty much jumbled up in film noir. So if you accept Dinerstein's thesis that These are the three sources. I think what comes next will start to make more sense, and hopefully we'll be able to get a clearer definition of cool. Now, one thing has to be said really clearly early on. Cool cannot be bought. These are advertisements that I found online that just are really pretty hilarious, except they're kind of tragic too. There's actually an advertisement by a women's magazine, and this is a men's magazine, excuse me, how to get the James Dean look. And you can buy the kinds of pants that he wore, the shirts and the sunglasses and all of that. There's a whole line, a marketable potpourri of great cool clothes that you can buy. And then the idea presumably is that you too can be cool. But no, you can't. It just doesn't work that way. These are Marlon Brando clothes. This leather jacket is a knockoff of the one that he wore in The Wild One, and you can buy it for a mere 1,100 pounds. Now, if you want to look like Marlon Brando from this British manufacturing company, this shirt, which is just a very simple pullover t-shirt, really long sleeve t-shirt that he wore in, I think it was A Streetcar Named Desire, that costs 170 pounds. I mean, just so if you want to be cool, get out your checkbook today because it's going to cost you a lot. Jack Kerouac was one of the early avatars of cool. He's the beat writer from the early 1950s, late 40s and early 50s, On the Road, the Dharma Bums, and so forth. And here's the real Jack Kerouac on the left. But you can buy his outfit today if you want to. The point is, though, a cool character would say you just can't buy it. It has to come from within. Cool is a way of being in the world that's unique to your personality, that you have to forge in the darkness of the night almost, because it's a tough role to take on. You're butting up against all the social norms, and it just means that your whole life is going to be an uphill struggle. If you really read the works of these existentialist writers or biographies of Brando and Humphrey Bogart, one of the characters we'll be looking at, you would stop and think, would I even really want to be cool? Probably not. I mean, it's too much work. It's much easier to just sort of fake it. And that's the way you can, if you want to. It's just that it would be ersatz cool and not the real thing. It's just not that easy. Here's another advertisement I found that I really like: how to look cool while driving your car. And it's by the fashionable housewife. And the thinking is, if you just get a Mustang or something that would convey this image of being with it, being in the know, somehow that could make you cool. These are expensive glasses. I think they're Maui Jims or something like that. Again, though, you can buy all the accoutrements, but it's not going to make you cool. Cool is only something that you can forge for yourself. As this is one of the cool women. You've noticed up until now, most of my characters that I've shown you are men. And cool, this Dinnerstein argues, is predominantly a masculine phenomenon, because women in this time period, the 1940s, the 1950s, were still expected to be nice. And you can't be nice and cool at the same time. That's just impossible. So the women that took up the banner of cool, you might say, had to be willing to suffer a lot of criticism by mainstream society. Many of them paid a dear, dear price for their effort to carve out their own individual response to the world. Many of them become alcoholics, drug addicts. That's kind of part of cool also. Cool people typically don't live very long, by the way. If you look through the actuarial tables of cool people, most of them die, a lot of them die in their 20s, 30s, 40s. I think that's not an accident. I think it's such a It's really hard to strike out on your own and leave the beaten path, which is why most of us don't do it. But Billie Holiday had that to say, which I think defines it. If I'm going to sing like someone else, then I don't need to sing at all. You could sort of see that that's kind of a summary of the whole nature of that individual imperative to live out your own destiny and not copy someone else's. She was referring, when she made that statement, to the fact that her style was, many people tried to copy it. And just as Miles Davis, many musicians tried to copy the way he played. And they felt that this was, people were completely missing the point if you try to copy a cool person, because it can't be like clothes that you simply put on. It has to be a creative act, a kind of an existential decision to say, I'm going to live my own life the way I want to. And basically, if you don't like it, I don't care. That's your problem, not mine. Cool has to be earned, usually through suffering. It's a lonely road that you're following when you're cool. And here we see three classic cool figures from the 1940s and 50s. Humphrey Bogart on the left. Clint Eastwood qualifies as cool, according to Joel Dinerstein, because he kind of represents the last wave of cool, you might say, in the 1960s with his spaghetti westerns, and then subsequently his Dirty Harry movies. But what makes Clint Eastwood, at least in this manifestation of his career, cool is the fact that he's a loner. He is, in his characters in the movies, he's always by himself. Sometimes he doesn't even have a name. In one of the movies, High Plains Drifter, I think it was, he doesn't have a name. He's referred to by the townspeople as the stranger. And that's probably no accident, because we mentioned the existentialist influence on this whole concept. And some of you might remember that the French existentialist writer Albert Camus wrote a book called The Stranger. And it's the idea is that if you don't even have a name, that means you're not really rooted in your community, are you? Because names are our identity. And if you're the stranger, the High Plains drifter just coming through town and you're going to leave tomorrow, that means you just don't fit in. And that's kind of part of the cool persona too, is I just can't adhere to the norms of society. I refuse to do it. Here, Frank Sinatra is one of his, that was when he was playing a detective. And Sinatra had a tough life too. If you read any biographies of him, it was a tough road to hoe for sure. So I take this phrase from a Bogart movie. I think it was one of his Raymond Chandler detective movies when he plays Philip Marlowe, and he's always getting beaten up by some bad guy, or sometimes by the police even. And Bogart says, I'm beat, but I'm not beaten, implying that there is an attitude of defiance. Like, you may put me in jail, you may take away everything I have, but you can't take away my soul, because that's the one thing I laid claim to when I carved it out, you might say, through my suffering, through my reflections at 3 o'clock in the morning about the meaning of life. That is, I think, what he was driving at when he says, you can't have me. There's a great line from another really cool character. Who's that? Cool Hand Luke. I mean, he really personified that image of someone who just wouldn't give in to society. He was going to do his own thing. And as I say on the top of my screen here, this is the price you pay. I mean, if you really wanted to be cool, it was, you're likely to have to pay for it with your life in one way or another. But Paul Newman says in Cool Hand Luke to the man with no eyes, you might remember he's the prison guard that wears the sunglasses that has the reflector, the mirror lenses, so you can't even see what he looks like. And he's always harassing the Paul Newman character, Luke. And Luke says, you don't own me. You will never own me. Even if you have me in jail, you can beat me up tonight with a rubber hose, but that doesn't mean you own me. So that was the essential core message, I think, of so many of the cool characters of the 50s was, I can be a free man or a woman. I'm willing to pay the price. It's a steep price, but it's one that I have to pay because I just can't knuckle under. Now, I should stop here just for a second to say, again, would any of us in this room really want to live that way? I don't. I mean, I like having my own little house to come home to at night, and my dog, and I don't want to have the whole thing thrown up in the air and be have my life turned upside down. The cool person has to be willing to risk that. And so it's a word, no wonder the word was stripped of its meaning, I think, is because it's sort of more comfortable to play at cool than it is to be cool. I hope that distinction kind of makes sense here. You wouldn't want to wind up in Paul Newman's shoes at the end of that movie. The reward, though, what's the point in living that way if it's so hard and if they die young? And they all are, not all of them, but a great number of them are drug addicts, alcoholics, they smoke too much. Why would you follow that path? Well, the writer that I alluded to a moment ago, Albert Camus, wrote a classic of existential philosophy called The Myth of Sisyphus. And in that, it's not even a book, it's an essay about 25 or 30 pages long or so. Camus retells the ancient Greek myth of Sisyphus, who was a mortal, but Sisyphus was sort of half mortal and half godlike, but he disobeyed a crucial rule laid down by the gods of Mount Olympus. And that is, Sisyphus managed to lock up death so that no one had to die. And in the Greek myth, the gods were not pleased with Sisyphus's work. This is not the way things are supposed to be. All mortals have to die someday. And so they punish Sisyphus for breaking this fundamental rule. They condemn him to all eternity to the punishment of rolling a gigantic stone up this huge mountain, grunting, sweating, tugging every step of the way. And finally, just as the boulder reaches the top of the mountain, it goes crashing back down the mountain and rolls all the way to the base again. And Sisyphus has to turn around, walk back down the mountain, and start the whole process over again, knowing it's hopeless. The gods have decreed this is my punishment. I can't get out of it. I have to do this for all eternity as my penance for breaking the rule on imprisoning death. So what's the reward in that? Well, Camus makes the statement, because Sisyphus is free. If he had just blindly followed the rules that the gods laid down for him, yeah, his life would have been a lot easier, but he would have been, in some sense, a slave. And that's what all cool people are trying to avoid, is this life of conformity in which you are basically a slave to the current social norms. So the payoff for Sisyphus and for anyone who wants to take it on as their task in life is that you can be free. The gods may be able to, just like Luke said, the gods may be able to beat you up. The gods may be able to punish you throughout all eternity. Granted, all of that is true, but they cannot take away your soul and your freedom. And Sisyphus was acting as a free agent when he made that decision to imprison death, violating the cardinal rule of Mount Olympus. By the way, this is Albert Camus up here. Do you notice any resemblance? He and Bogart could be twin brothers or something, and that's not an accident. All these French existentialist writers of the 1940s read all the American mystery novels that were so popular at the time, Raymond Chandler and James Carr and all those people, and loved them. They thought they were, Simone de Beauvoir actually thought they were really good literature. And so many of them take on some of the mannerisms of the American hero, Philip Marlowe, the central character in this series of novels by Raymond Chandler. I think it's pretty fascinating that both or all three of these characters, Camus, that's James Dean, and that our iconic photograph taken during a rainstorm in New York City, walking down the street, cigarette hanging out of the corner of his, I mean, all cool people smoke, by the way. So it's another reason not to be cool. These are some pretty arresting images, though, I think. Okay, gotta keep moving here. Cool, it has an ethic that is, as the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche would have said, it's beyond good and evil, because the cool person hammers out his own code of ethics. And sometimes that means doing some really bad things. Like one of the coolest of all the actors in film noir was Robert Mitchum. This guy, again, you could try to copy Robert Mitchum, you could comb your hair like him, you could do all of that. It wouldn't work because he had that gift, and he had to earn it himself. I mean, it's too complicated of a story to go into now, but he lived a tough life. And these pictures kind of indicate that. And as one of his biographers put it, he was a lawless soul. We're talking about the real Robert Mitchum now, not his acting roles. He was a lawless soul who looked like a veteran boxer who had learned something from every shot he had ever taken. I think that's a terrific line and really appropriate to Mitchum. I mean, Mitchum was so cool that he was arrested in 1948 for marijuana possession at a time that was just not okay in Hollywood. And the studio that he was working for insisted that he go into rehab in order to overcome his predilection for marijuana. And he agreed to do it. But the first night after the first meeting, and he's driving home, he stops off at his local bar for a couple of drinks. I mean, I would say he didn't quite internalize the message, let's put it that way, that was required of him. But Robert Mitchum becomes one of the early avatars of cool, and I think he explains it very well at the top here. I simply don't care what you think of me. And he actually walked the talk even. I mean, he walked away from many lucrative job offers in Hollywood because he didn't want to play roles that he felt were just either too frivolous or went too deeply against the grain of his own cool persona that he had worked on. I think the second line is also very revealing. There just isn't any pleasing some people. The trick is to stop trying. That's pure vintage Robert Mitchum. Mitchum, you might recall, when I was little, I cut my teeth on Hopalong Cassidy movies on TV. And Mitchum was often cast as the bad guy in the Hopalong Cassidy movies. So then in those early Hoppy movies, which were in the 1940s, the directors around Hollywood realized this man really had talent, and we were wasting him by having him in these grade B Westerns. So we're gonna take him out of the Hopalong Cassidy movies and give him some really meaty roles, Cape Fear and so on. Probably many of you have seen a lot of his movies. And so I thought this would be a nice time to sort of give you some examples in order to make it really clear what cool is and what not cool is. And we'll show you a number of cultural icons that contrast the two. And again, I'll say it for the last time. I don't want to belabor the point, but please don't don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that cool people are desirable and that you'd want your daughter to marry a cool guy or something like that. That's not the case. And it's also not the case to say that uncool people, and we'll be taking a look at some uncool people, are bad. They're not. They may be boring, but they're not bad, okay? So it's a crucial distinction. We're not talking about morality here. This is like Nietzsche's maxim, beyond good and evil. So here we're going to take a look at a popular genre of the 1950s, a cool Western hero on the left and a very uncool one on the right. Now, who's this fellow? Paladin. He's so cool, like Clint Eastwood, he doesn't have a name. Paladin is the chess piece that was on the holster of his gun. If you remember in the show, Have Gun Will Travel. And it was also on his card, Have Gun Will Travel, Wire Paladin, San Francisco. And then it would show the chess piece on it. That was his identity. Paladin did not have a home. Does anybody remember from this TV show where he lived? In a hotel near Chinatown in San Francisco. He has a hotel room there. That's where he lives until he gets too bored with sitting around smoking these elegant cigars and reading the newspapers in the lobby. And then he goes out on his job. And that's when he starts to dress all in black. I mean, in a way, it was pretty redundant of me to put cool and uncool up there. You could have told, I mean, readily identified for yourself who the cool guy was here. Paladin represented this. He doesn't work for the police. He's not a US Marshal like Matt Dillon. He's a mercenary, essentially, working for himself. And he goes out and he takes crime situations in hand in exchange for a lot of money. He's someone who's in it for himself. And that too seems to be part of the cool persona. Now, Lorne Greene as Ben Cartwright, very likable man in the TV show, but he wasn't cool. Why? Because he was part of the establishment, when you think about it. I mean, the Ponderosa was like a little empire, and he was the boss. He was the head man of the empire. He has these 3 sons, all of whom obey him without question. So he has this aura of patriarchal authority. Little Joe and Haas and Adam are going to do whatever he says without questioning him. And patriarchy, by definition, is not cool. Because again, you're sort of bowing down before tradition if you adhere to the rules of the patriarchy. And that is like a cardinal sin, you might say, for the true cool guy. That's why Paladin can't have a wife, he can't have a dog, can't have a home in the suburbs. None of that would have appealed to him. He's sort of like floating on the edges of society and intervenes only when it suits him to do so. How about this one? All right, this is a softball question. Who's the cool one? This is Steve McQueen in Bullitt, of course. One of the last, according to Dinnerstein at least, if you accept his thesis, one of the last of the true cool detectives in the movies. And he too he's working for the police department. He actually is a member of the SFPD, but he's sort of a renegade cop within the system. He's really kind of like Paladin. He's doing his own thing in the movie Bullet. And he has this very, very composed, calm demeanor. That's another part about cool, is literally you don't act like you're very excited. As a matter of fact, it's better to act like you're kind of bored most of the time. That projects an image of self-control, being contained within yourself. That means that, again, no one can really reach you and upset you. Now, Joe Friday, so uncool, it's unbelievable. In Dragnet, I remember one episode which epitomizes how uncool he was. He and remember Henry Morgan was his sidekick in that show? They infiltrate a hippie commune. How they did that is sort of beyond me, but this is like 1967 Los Angeles. They infiltrate a hippie commune and they act like they're hippies. Pretty ridiculous. And then Sergeant Friday encourages the hippies to smoke pot with him. And so sure enough, man, one of the hippies pulls out a joint, lights it up, passes it over to Joe Friday, and immediately Joe Friday shows his badge and says, "You're under arrest." A sting operation of the, but certainly this is a stark contrast between that whole notion of working for the system. He's really represents the law and order system of modern day Los Angeles. Cool and uncool on the battlefield. Who is this guy? Can you recognize him? Who? This is Marlon Brando, if you can believe it. Marlon Brando in Apocalypse Now, toward the end of his life. By that time, Brando had become almost a sad caricature of himself. He had ballooned up to like 330 pounds. He just ate ice cream all day long. He didn't really go out much anymore. He took the role of Apocalypse Now because it was a very lucrative role. And he plays the renegade army colonel in Vietnam named Colonel Kurtz, who goes off the reservation, you might say, and becomes an independent third force in the Vietnam War, fighting against both the American forces and the Viet Cong, because he feels both sides are utterly corrupt and wrong. Brando was so huge by the time Apocalypse Now was filmed that the director had to film him only from the neck up and hide the rest of his body in darkness. Brando, of course, always was one of the central gurus, you might say, of the cool phenomenon in America. Now, I would say John Wayne, and again, I'm not making a value judgment here, but John Wayne is not cool. Sands of Iwo Jima and the Green Beret, because he's too much part of the establishment. He is the defender of American virtues. One of John Wayne's biographers said that basically he was a practitioner of muscular Christianity, a term that was taken from about 100 years ago. Muscular Christianity thrust back onto the frontier or the war movies. So, by the way, there's an interesting anecdote told about Marlon Brando. Actually, I saw it. Maybe many of you did too. He was so cool that he could completely make fun of himself because it wasn't a problem for him to have people not like him. That was how deeply committed he was to following his own path. And he was being interviewed on 60 Minutes once by Connie Chung. And Connie was kind of tiptoeing delicately around different questions. And finally, she says to him, Marlon, it's no secret that you have struggled with your weight for a long time. And Brando puts up his hand and stops her and says, Connie, why don't you just say I'm fat? That's a cool response, though, isn't it? When you think about it, it really is. He's not going to say, oh, well, I'm going into Weight Watchers next week. Don't worry, I'll slim down. No, he was perfectly content in his old age to just eat quarts of ice cream every day. Political cool. Usually in earlier times, yeah, this shows how you can't just fake it, right? It has to be the real thing. This is in 1968 during the presidential primary season, and Life magazine ran a picture of Bobby Kennedy up in Oregon running along the beach with one of his dogs. And obviously that was a pretty cool picture. That was a pretty good thing. So Richard Nixon says to his advisors, we've got to get a photo op for me like that. And so they go to San Clemente and they arrange all the photographers and everything. And then Nixon walks along the beach. But the reason I put this arrow there, he's wearing wingtips on the beach. Decidedly uncool, really. Cool music. Yeah, hardly anything needs to be said about this picture. It has Bob Dylan, 1961, Lawrence Welk. Now, again, probably from everything I've read, my mother was a big Lawrence Welk fan, and she read a lot about him. And she felt, at least, and I'll take her word for it, that he was a really nice guy. And I don't question that. I don't doubt that. Bob Dylan was probably a very surly, sarcastic, not very nice guy, and would be just as likely to insult you if you had him over for coffee as to make polite small talk. Whereas, no, this fellow, so there's not necessarily a real advantage in having cool people around. Cool humor, I think, is a good example. Now, again, I like Red Skelton, and everything I've ever heard about him said he too was a real nice guy. And here was a guy with a very sharp tongue and would insult you. I mean, in a group like this, a bunch of elegant ladies, he would say something utterly inappropriate, just to sort of shake you up and to shock you probably, but also I think it was because he was just trying to live out that internal persona that he had created for himself. Now we'll talk about some women that are cool and not cool. Anybody recognize this figure on the left? Veronica Lake, good job. Veronica Lake comes on the scene in the 1940s. She's one of the earlier embodiments of the feminine cool mystique, I think you might say. She makes this hairstyle so popular that the women that were working in the war plants during World War II all started wearing their hair like that. And the hair literally would get caught in the machinery. I mean, the grinder and stuff. You can't really make a B-26 bomber with one eye very effectively. So the bosses at these war plants had to instruct the women to, you know, put your hair back in a bun or a ponytail or something like that. She had that kind of a cultural significance, and she was very unorthodox, shall we say, in terms of the traditional code of feminine behavior at that time. I mean, she's openly seductive. She's playing a game with all of her characters in the movie. She's trying to get something. She's dishonest in these roles, but definitely very cool. And Doris Day, wholesome, nice, sweet, uncool though, because she's too nice. She's too sweet. People like Veronica Lake, I think she would have been insulted if you would have said, oh, you're a sweet girl. No, that just was not what she was out to accomplish in life. This is one of my favorite cool ladies of the 1940s, Barbara Stanwyck. And she kind of epitomizes this, I'm going to do my own thing. How much time do we have left? We're coming down to the end here. Yeah, I've got to wrap up. So we're going to go quickly from here. Lauren Bacall, of course, ultra cool. And you could actually have a whole lecture on her and it would be fascinating, and we don't have time to do it. Why is she cool though? But kind of like Veronica Lake and Barbara Stanwyck, she just embodies this independent woman of the 1940s. She's going to marry Humphrey Bogart and then Jason Robards. She has 3 kids, and And she breaks the cool rule because she lives until she's 89. That's not common amongst, again, so many of these people. Billie Holiday, I think Billie Holiday dies in her 40s, probably from drugs, most likely, drugs and alcohol. Now, here's one of my favorite cool characters, Dorothy Parker, a defiant woman in New York City, living on her own in the 1940s. She is one of the original founders of the famed Algonquin Round Table at the hotel in the middle of New York City, famous for her witticisms, her deliciously wicked bon mots, where she would just toss these thoughts off the top of her head, seemingly, not seemingly spontaneously, they were spontaneous. That was to her the essence of cool, was if you go into a situation prepared with a bunch of witty remarks, that's not really fair. That's not cool. As a matter of fact, the Algonquin Round Table had a rule: you can't prepare for this. You show up and you say what you can come up with on the moment. And this passage from her, I think, illustrates her defiant side. All right, God, send me to hell. You think you're frightening me with your hell, don't you? You think your hell is worse than mine? And she meant it. She has a horrible life. I mean, she's a classic example of someone who pays a heavy price for being cool. She goes through a string of bad relationships. She becomes an alcoholic. The last probably 10 years or more of her life, she becomes sort of a semi-recluse, living in her apartment in New York City, smoking and drinking herself to death. It's a pretty tragic figure, but in her prime, she was one tough lady and didn't care, again, what you thought of her. But no, I'll just give you a couple of my favorite witticisms that she could toss off at the drop of a hat. One of them was, she said, you can take a horticulture, but you can't make her think. Another one was, let's see, she, if all the girls who attended the Yale prom this year were laid end to end, I wouldn't be surprised. And this is the kind of thing that she came, she once said, the shorter the skirt you wear, the quicker the party will come to you. That was just her whole demeanor, was to shock, to titillate, but also to live out her independence. I mean, as sad as her ending was, I think she wouldn't have had it any other way. One last figure, and then I know we have to stop, unfortunately. Actually, I'm going to skip that. This is somebody some of you might remember, Anita O'Day. Does that ring a bell to any of you? The jazz singer back in the 1940s, and a really excellent singer. Frank Sinatra thought that she was at least the equivalent of Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald and all the top female vocalists of her day. And she was someone who crossed borders in her effort to be cool. As you can see here, a drink in one hand and a cigar in the other. That was frightfully not done by nice ladies back in the 1940s, but she was not a nice lady. Here she is singing at a jazz festival in the 1950s, and you can see that she has her own unique stamp. She designed that hat that she wore, and she was super elegant, you know, the white gloves, everything. And many people, Dinnerstein says that people who are fashion experts credit Anita O'Day for actually inventing the modern day professional woman's look. That she wore a sport jacket and nice, tasteful, but short skirts at a time that just wasn't done back in the 30s and 40s. So this is just a little taste of this concept of cool. We could go on and on with it, but I hope now that you get the idea that it's a time-specific phenomenon. It lasted for as long as it could, until it became kind of taken over by Madison Avenue, you might say, and turned into an advertising brand. And that probably happened somewhere in the late 60s, 1970s, something like that, when clever image manipulators in the advertising industry managed to say, you know what, we can make money off of cool. And that's a shame, because cool and money weren't connected initially. So, okay, with that, we're going to stop. We're out of time, but I hope that some of you have some questions. Do we have time to take some questions? Yeah, we do. Okay. Anyone have a question?
I have a comment, though. It just occurred to me when you showed the picture of cool with the rolled up jeans and the loafers or the kind of wingtips without socks. That look is in all the fashion magazines. Like
Today, that's right. Yeah.
the runway. I mean, it's just
Her point is that a lot of these images that's from like the 50s, the rolled up Levi's, and a lot of guys now you'll see, I mean, guys that really know what they're doing. It isn't an accident. They're now wearing white socks with black shoes. That would have just been, don't do that, or no socks. That's right. But that's, I think Dinnerstein would say, but that again is sort of faux cool. That's not the real deal. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions that? It's called The Concept of the Origins, excuse me, The Origins of Cool in Post-War America. And the author is Joel Dinnerstein, Dinerstein. Yeah, it's an interesting book. It's a challenging book, but it really made me think about all these characters, and I found it very rewarding. Yes.
Excuse me, I'll bring a microphone to you so that everyone in the room.
Oh, that was George Carlin. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. A foul-mouthed cool man. Oh yeah, you could put him. I mean, in the interests of time, we have to only select a few, but you're right.
So if you have a question, we have, I think, some paper on the tables if you want to write out your question. And there's a microphone I have in my hand, and if you raise your hand, I'll bring it to you. And then I think the people from the Zoom team might have questions coming also.
No questions from home?
No questions from Zoom. Do we have?
There's one in the back.
Yeah. Oh, here she is. She's just the most wonderful lady here at T.
You didn't mention Marilyn Monroe.
Right.
Wasn't she the epitome?
I think she
Cool.
absolutely, and like so many others, she dies young and dies miserably unhappy. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I had to be very selective, but certainly Marilyn would fit into this category, definitely. Okay, ladies, if there are no more questions, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you.